I'm Pastor Bowman, and welcome to It's a Liturgical Life. This week was February 18th, and February 18th, man, what's so special about that? Well, it happens to be the Feast of Martin Luther. Now, I can't call myself a Lutheran and ignore the Feast of Martin Luther. So here we are, we're going to do a video, and in this video, I'm going to do a quick biography of Luther. Just please be aware that this is not going to be anywhere near comprehensive. I'm just going to be hitting some highlights here and a few other things. Otherwise, I'm going to have a really long video series. But anyhow, let's jump right into things. Now, Luther was born in November 10th, 1483. To help us understand where this is going to fall in our history, this is just a few years before Christopher Columbus began his fateful voyage. And Columbus would set sail about 9 years later in 1492, and he would discover that his math was wrong and that the world is bigger than he thought as he lands in what we would now call the West Indies. So here's Luther, born 1483 to his parents, Hans and Margarethe, and hopefully I pronounced that right. Uh, and they had him baptized the following day. And they followed was probably one of traditions. I haven't looked too closely, so I don't know if there's other traditions, but one of the traditions of the day is to name their child for the saint whose feast was that particular day. And well, as it so happens, November 11th is the feast of Saint Martin of Tours, and so they named him Martin. Now, I just want to point out really quick, St. Martin of Tours is an interesting fellow in his own right, and I would actually encourage you to go check him out and see what he is about. He's an interesting fellow, to say the least. But anyhow, uh, the Luther family was part of what I guess we could call the growing middle class, as he was what some would call a tradesman. Hans was involved in mining and smelting, and not so much as get out the pickaxe himself, but running the mine and whatnot. And as it turns out, Hans was a rather ambitious fellow and wanted to see his family continue to grow in respectability and in their position in society. And so he sent young Martin on a path to become a lawyer. And this would involve him going off to boarding schools and all sorts of things. And eventually he would end up at the University of Erfurt, where he would study to be a lawyer. He did manage to finish a degree there, and he was starting law school, so to speak, when he dropped out to enter the Augustinian monastery that was there in Erfurt. You probably have heard the story. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of it. He's walking home, and it's in the middle of a thunderstorm, and he cries out to Saint Anna to save him, and that if he gets home safe, he'll become a monk. And he followed through with that. And reportedly, Luther was a model monk. He was rather driven to find solace, and particularly considering how he weighted his sins. And that drive of him caused him to pursue the discipline of his cloister to the highest degree. And to be honest, that is saying something, as he was a part of a rather strict branch of the Augustinian order. In fact, they considered themselves to be the observant Augustinians, as opposed to the non-observant, who were more of a lax in their discipline. But anyhow, Luther was, for all records that we can know of, he was a model monk. And we know he was incredibly driven by his sins because he writes about it. And there's even some stories maybe apocryphal about how he was so concerned about his sins and dying in his sins that he spent hours and hours in confession, and reportedly was even told by one of his confessors to come back when he had something more interesting to confess. But anyhow, Luther was a model monk, and it was during this time that Luther's father superior sent him off to get a doctorate in theology. Um, his father superior recognized that he had kind of a sharp mind, and decided it would be a benefit to the order if he went off and learned theology. And he sent him to this brand new university in Wittenberg. And sending Luther to Wittenberg is probably the best thing that could have ever happened. One, it was during this time that Luther began to start grasping the full meaning of the gospel as God's gift of forgiveness. And though I will caution the listener, this wasn't really a light bulb moment where Luther goes from card carrying, good papal Roman Catholic to the boisterous reformer that we've come to know and love. And it's a little bit more gradual than that. And if you spend some time in his writings, you can see his understanding change with time, as opposed to just going from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, just an immediate shift. So on the one hand, we have him studying, he's teaching the scriptures to students, and at the same time, and this is also a thing that's going to come into play, is that being sent to Wittenberg, he is now under the rule of Prince Elector Frederick III. And you might be going, okay, so what does him being under a particular ruler matter? Frederick is or I should say was, an elector. And electors in the Holy Roman Empire were the people who determined who would be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, hence the name elector, because they would get together and they would select who would be the emperor. That's going to be important because that means whoever is the Holy Roman Emperor is going to, even if he doesn't want to, have to listen to Prince Frederick, because this is one of those guys who's got a say in things. And it's good to keep those people at least on reasonable terms, even if you don't agree on everything. So anyhow, we have that, and at the same time, there's outside forces that are going to be affecting things. And at this point in the history of Europe, the Holy Roman Empire is facing an ever-increasing threat by the Ottoman Empire. And they've already, I believe by this point, have overthrown the Byzantine Empire, which would be the land of Constantinople and where the Eastern Orthodox are. And so with this kind of a threat that's happening, it behooves the emperor to keep Saxony happy. And so having Prince Frederick as an elector and this the person of great influence is going to be very helpful later on, especially when things get testy. But anyhow, Luther, during his time at the university, would end up becoming something of a celebrity. In some ways, you could actually consider him to be like a rock star, and become a household kind of name. And the big turning point, though, is going to be, or a big turning point, is going to be when he's selected to represent the observant houses of the Augustinian order. Apparently, the Pope had decided he was going to do some things that they weren't really cool with. I believe it was along the lines of he was trying to unite the two parts of the Augustinian order, the observant and the unobservant or less strict houses. And Luther, with his legal background and being one of their professors, was selected to go and plead their case before the Pope. And, well, let's just say Luther's experience left him very jaded. He's recorded as noting that the closer they got to Rome, the more lavish the lifestyle of the monks. They weren't really observing the various rules of the orders that they were supposed to be observing. In fact, he was really not a fan of Rome. Uh, he, he he had kind of a one of those pedestal type views where he's put Rome up on a pedestal, and so he imagined this highly pious city, which is understandable. I mean, that's where the Pope was. That's the seat of power for the Roman Church. One would expect that that's going to be a pious place. What he found was more of a tourist trap and a den of iniquity. I, in some ways, you may not be far off to compare Rome with modern day Las Vegas. Okay, I mean, just not a great place. And this experience would begin to cause Luther to question some things. But now note that it's not at this point that we're going to have some cosmic shift. It's just a beginning. Um, the thing that would prove to be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, or the big tipping point, is when a Dominican monk by the name of Johann Tetzel, Johann Tetzel, would begin touring in Germany to raise money for building the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. And he would do so by the means of selling indulgences. And for those of you who aren't familiar, an indulgence is a kind of a paper form that supposedly declares you to have been absolved of particular sins or different things. And Tetzel was using these as a fundraiser, um, convincing the laity that if they were to put money in the coffer, they could set free the souls of their loved ones from purgatory and all sorts of things. And he had put on quite a stage show. Was a very convincing man. And Luther was getting irritated by this. A man convincing people that they could buy forgiveness. And it just, that bothered him. And so he set out to see if he could get things to change here. And he wanted to do so in an orderly fashion. He said, let's have a debate over this. And he this is what you did. And so he took and posted a list of theses or ideas that he wanted to debate about and posted them on the door of the church. The door being something of a bulletin board and was used for these kind of things. I know movies and whatnot, they'll show this great scene with marching purposefully up to the door and everybody's, what's Luther doing as he's hammering? Most people probably didn't even notice. They started to pay more attention when people took a look at what he said. And at the same time, particularly because at the same time, the Saxons were growing ever more restless with Rome and its endless demands for money. And so they seized upon this debate as a way of pursuing, their issues. And one of the things that happened is somebody took this relatively new invention called the Gutenberg printing press, translated Luther's works, the theses, from Latin into German, and published that with the brand new printing press. And almost overnight, especially considering the limitations of travel and the way news would spread, Luther became a celebrity as his 95 Theses were spread out all over Europe in a period of a few months. So you could think of as this being one of the early viral sellers, excuse me, bestseller, and it was an academic paper, and it wasn't exactly riveting reading. And granted, he was asking some very challenging questions, and questions that definitely needed to be asked considering what Tetzel was doing at that time. Though I will say right now, folks reading the 95 Theses today are probably going to be a little bit disappointed, as I suspect many folks today would be looking for some great Reformation-themed manifesto that was going to take it to the Pope. That manifesto wouldn't come until later on. The theses that Luther posted were the theses of a good Roman Catholic priest, who was concerned for the souls of his parishioners, in light of what he thought was another priest who had just gone off the rails. And when he posted the 95 Theses, he thought that when it came to the Pope's attention and to the Archbishop of Mainz, when he heard about it, that they would bring an end to these abuses. What Luther never expected was that, guess who sent Tetzel? And so Luther was really caught off guard when he received pushback over these theses. And it can be argued that this pushback is what really pushed Luther into examining what the scriptures say about forgiveness and the assurance of said forgiveness. And if there's one thing I can say about Luther, is that he was really driven by the desire to make sure people had the assurance of the forgiveness of their sins. And that was a big driving force. And you'll see that in his later works, where he's really hammering away at how can we know for certain that we are forgiven, and we can manage to communicate that to the oppressed soul that needs the healing that the gospel can give. But anyway, backing up a little bit here, back to the 95 Theses. This call for debate would set off decades worth of debates, which I would argue will hit kind of a pinnacle at the Diet of Augsburg. I know a lot of people would focus on Luther's "Here I Stand" moment at the Diet of Worms, but it's at the Diet of Augsburg that I would say that the debate became a united confession, with the presentation of the Augsburg Confession and the defense of the Augsburg Confession. And don't get me wrong, and the Diet of Worms is a very pivotal moment in Luther's history. And would set into motion a whole bunch of things. And it's when he left the Diet of Worms that he was kidnapped and placed by Prince Frederick in a castle so that he couldn't be killed. And Luther, being Luther and just not being able to sit still, did some fantastic work while he was in the castle of Wartburg. But really, as far as a church thing, the Diet of Augsburg is more impactful. And much of that's going to stem from the two documents, the Augsburg Confession and the defense of the Augsburg Confession, which are key parts of this book. You get it on the screen better. Which is the Book of Concord. This is the Concordia edition. You can see it says down here, Reader's Edition of the Book of Concord. That book, it contains the confessions of the Lutheran Church, and two of the central confessions are the Augsburg Confession and the defense of the Augsburg Confession, also commonly known as the Apology. I haven't been using that term because most people hear apology and they think, oh, I'm sorry. And they definitely didn't say I'm sorry. No, apology means to defend, and while they were defending what they put in the Augsburg Confession against, oh no, I forget the term. What was the confutation? There we go. Like in the confutation, and well, yeah, the defense, it's good stuff, and the Lutheran churches in today, particularly the ones that would call themselves the confessional churches, these are their defining documents, and so they actually, in many ways, have greater impact than Luther himself, which is interesting. Even though we're called Lutherans, Luther wasn't at the Diet. He had a death warrant hanging over his head, and there was no guarantee of safe conduct, so he stayed home while a colleague of his, Philip Melanchthon, went to the Diet of Augsburg along with a few others. And the Augsburg Confession and the defense of the Augsburg Confession are largely written by Philip Melanchthon. Now, this isn't to say Luther didn't have a say in what was written, and they do reflect Luther's understanding. It's just we don't see Luther himself there at the Diet because, well, he'd be captured, he'd be killed, and that just wouldn't be good for Luther. But anyhow, the Augsburg Confession, the defense, they reflect Luther's teaching, in particular in that they do not present the church as breaking away from the church. That just didn't make a lot of sense there. But the case that the Augsburg Confession and the subsequent defense of the Augsburg Confession is that the reformers are in one voice with the historical church. And so a big part of these confessions is that they are trying to make the case that we are in agreement with the folks we would call the ancient church fathers. And so they're dealing with abuses that have come up, and that they're desiring unity, not to separate. That's one thing that I think people miss a lot is Luther did not desire to separate from Rome. He honestly was hoping that Rome would just clean up its act and we could all be one big, happy Roman Catholic Church. And so these confessions reflect that. You'll still see some of that when we get to another confession, which is the small called articles, which are written by Luther himself. In fact, many call that Luther's last will and testament because it was written shortly before he passed away and was meant to unite Germany in the face of a possible invasion and all that, and to bring together some disparate parts of the Reformation. But anyhow, that didn't happen. But as apparently some guys were insistent that Jesus didn't mean what Jesus meant when he said, "This is my body." And you can't go that way. But anyhow, back to Luther. Luther was a busy fellow. And all throughout these years, this man was busy. He continued teaching his classes at the university. He preached and performed his pastoral duties, and he wrote. He wrote a lot. There are well over 50 volumes of his works translated into English, and that does not even remotely cover everything that Luther wrote. Now, that's not to say that everything he wrote is awesomely and wonderful, and there's a lot of personal correspondence that's out there, and well, of some interest, you learn a little bit about the man and some of the things he's talking about, but he, he, he wrote a bunch, and so there's just a lot out there for somebody who's interested in just diving into his mind, so to speak. But I would say if you're going to read Luther, his most noticeable and best works are going to be his catechisms and his translation of the scriptures into German. But I'm going to focus more on the catechisms because, I'm not expecting people to go read the German Bible when you get perfectly serviceable English translations now. But his catechisms, these are just they're just pure gold. And he takes and condenses the scriptures down into some bite-sized summaries that anybody can digest. And it's a huge help when it comes to covering the scope of the scriptures and to understanding the scriptures and to keep everything in mind as you're reading through the scriptures so that you're not isolating one part from another and causing all sorts of confusion. And they're just really helpful tools, and they're beautifully laid out and easy to read and easy to understand for the most part. Um, Sometimes you have to do a little bit of work, because I remember he's writing back in the 1500s. We're now in the 2000s, and language is different, and our experiences are a little different, but it's still good. It's still worth reading. So I would highly encourage you, if you're interested in really getting to know Luther and reading some of his best work, read his catechisms. And the small catechism, that shouldn't take you more than an hour. It's pretty short. And his larger catechism, really, it isn't, you know, it, it's not going to, take you years to get through. It'll be really quick. And they're a fantastic help. And of course, to have the scriptures in the people's own tongue, that was a spectacular thing. And that was just one of those works that came out of his time when he's at Warburg and he's nothing to do. Let's translate the Bible. And so he did. Um, though I will point out that Luther's translation of the Bible is not the first time somebody translated the Bible. And technically, the Vulgate is a translation of the Bible. That the Vulgate would be the Latin translation, and that was the official version of the Bible in the Roman Catholic Church. But there were also some other more vernacular translations that were attempted. I think Tinsdale did one, and there was at least one other, and it's slipping from my mind at this moment. But they had done work on translating the Bible prior to Luther, and Rome didn't really take kindly to that because, for whatever reason, they felt that it really needed to be in Latin. And so the guys who had done these translations, they'd see their works burned, and they would be punished for doing this blasphemous work of making it so people can read the Bible. But thankfully, and this is again where Prince Frederick comes into play, he had Luther's back, and so the authorities of the time weren't able to get to Luther, and had also protected his works. And so we are today blessed by the work that Luther did so many years ago. But anyhow, I know this is a really quick video. It's quick and dirty. I have not even remotely covered Luther's life, just giving you some highlights. And so I hope this has been enlightening. And but at the same time, I know I really haven't tread any new ground or anything. But to be honest, really does everything need to be brand new. And I didn't even cover Katie, and Katie is a major influence on Luther. But anyhow, knowing that I'm really keeping this short and very sweet, hopefully sweet, I want to encourage you to go out and read some things. There's many different biographies. Not all of them are worth reading, but so I'll just caution you there, and you're likely to find some bad stuff on the internet. I'll never forget the Wikipedia article years ago talking about Luther's favorite shoes. And don't ask me. And if you want something that's kind of quick and easy to get into, there's this particular one that was produced when they came out with the Luther movie. Yeah, like 10 years ago or something like that. I just realized it's been a while. In fact, I think that, oh man, this must have come out. Oh wow, yeah, it did. It came out during my vicarage. So it's been more than 10 years. But anyhow, this is a quick, easy one to get into, easy to read. It was actually, in fact, I believe, written for a younger set. So, but it's still got good information. If you want to get more depth, I'd encourage you to read something more along the lines of Kittelson here. He's got a pretty decent biography of Luther. There are some others, I just don't happen to have them on hand. But anyhow, I hope this has all been a blessing to you, and I would really encourage you to read more about Luther. He is an interesting fellow, and I would also encourage you to read the things that he wrote. He's got some fantastic things to say, and he is definitely a very pastoral person in his writings. So I should asterisk that. Unless he's doing his polemics, then he can have a rough tongue. But when he's writing to his parishioners, when he's writing to help his students, there's just going to be some solid gold stuff there, and just wonderful things to share. But anyhow, blessings to you. This has been a liturgical life, and hope to see you again.